Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, dear conference participants and colleagues joining us online. It's my pleasure to welcome us all to this joint event by the Independent Units of the Green Climate Fund. The purpose of the event today is to highlight the work that the independent units, the accountability mechanism of the Green Climate Fund, performs. It's a unique feature of the governing instrument of the Green Climate Fund that a set of independent accountability units was created. Conceptually, the idea is to provide independent oversight of the work of the Green Climate Fund in order to ensure its credibility and its accountability to all parties of the GCF. It's my pleasure to welcome my colleagues on the panel, and let me attempt a brief introduction. Starting from my far left, Mr. Andreas Reumann is the head ad interim of the Independent Evaluation Unit of the Green Climate Fund. Prior to this position, Andreas served as Principal Evaluation Officer of the IEU, undertaking several evaluations, global evidence reviews, and capacity building work. He has extensive experience in designing impact monitoring systems for large research for development projects, impact evaluations, forensic foresight analysis, and developing alternative evaluation methods. Andreas has previously worked at the Center for International Forestry Research, focusing on monitoring and evaluation and learning capacity. He holds a bachelor's in European Economic Studies and a Master of Science in Economics from the University of Copenhagen. Let me also introduce my other colleague, Mr. Paco Gimenez-Salinas. Paco is Compliance and Dispute Resolution Specialist at the Independent Redress Mechanism of the Green Climate Fund. Mr. Salinas was born in Spain, is a lawyer by profession, and is specialized in alternative dispute resolution with a focus in mediation. He has participated in cases handled by the Compliance Advisory Ombudsman of the International Finance Corporation as an external facilitator, as well as in cases managed by the Independent Consultation and Investigation Mechanism at the Inter-American Development Bank. In that role, he was in the role of its consultation phase coordinator. In Mexico, he spent several years working in the field of community mediation, and amongst other experiences, he has participated in the design and facilitation of several major multi-party dialogues around issues such as air pollution reduction strategies, the impacts of dams and windmill fields, the strengthening of conflict resolution mechanisms, of land tenure-related conflicts, etc. Mr. Gimenez-Salinas has undertaken postgraduate studies in the fields of conflict resolution at the University of Barcelona, political analysis at the Mexican University, CIDE, and community company mediation at the University of Cape Town. I would attempt a further introduction, and let me introduce my colleague, the head of the Independent Redress Mechanism, Dr. Lalanath de Silva, who is joining us virtually for this meeting. Dr. de Silva is the head of the Independent Redress Mechanism. He has extensive experience in legal affairs, with more than 30 years of service as a practicing lawyer. In Sri Lanka, he supported the Ministry of Environment as a legal consultant and was a member of the country's Law Commission. Lalanath previously worked at the Environmental Claims Unit of the UN Compensation Commission in Geneva and served as Director of the Environmental Democracy Practice at the World Resources Institute, WRI, in Washington, D.C. As a member of the Compliance Review Panel of the Asian Development Bank, he led the review of multiple compliance cases. Lalanath has a PhD from the University of Sydney, a Master of Laws from the University of Washington, and graduated from the Sri Lanka Law College as an attorney at law. I think we can now proceed to the program. Just by way of introduction, I head the Independent Integrity Unit, and my name is Ibrahim Pam, and I think that's totally sufficient. So now I think we'll hand over to Andreas for the first presentation from the Independent Evaluation Unit.
Thank you, Lalanath. Thank you, Ibrahim. Thank you, Lalanath, for being virtually with us, and thank you, Paco, for being here as well. And for the audience, we have even a few early risers here in the audience, just to hear the GCF Pavilion at COP26. Not a usual sight for early morning sessions, but glad to have you as well. And of course, for those that are in the sky, joining us virtually and following us here on this event on talking about accountability evaluations as well as redress. As said, I'm from the evaluation unit, so our bread and butter is basically evaluations. I've got a few slides to present. Perhaps if we could put them up, that would be great. Yes, thank you very much. Next slide, please. So what I wanted you to first and foremost understand is where we sit within the institutional structure of the GCF. So you've got, generally speaking, the GCF board, which looks at the question of a decision-making for the GCF, all that goes from projects to policies and other aspects. Then you've got the GCF Secretariat, which basically enforces all the operational parts of the GCF and thinking about the policy work, as well as, most importantly, the appraisal of projects. And then the Independent Evaluation Unit. And fourth, I usually have a box there on the left-hand side as well. Yeah, thank you very much. On the CSOs and PSOs representatives, the observers, that are also sitting there and informing the board on the positioning of the civil society as well as the private sector organizations. So the independent unit, the Independent Evaluation Unit, generally asks two questions. And these are very traditional questions that we ask as evaluators. So we usually ask the question of, are we doing things right? So we're asking the question about effectiveness, efficiency, sustainability, and many other things. I'll come to that in a second. When we look at the operations and the performance of the fund. But in addition to this, we also ask the question of, are we doing the right things? So in addition to asking, as I said, in addition to addressing the effectiveness and efficiency and sustainability of the fund and the fund's actions, we also ask the actions, what could do the fund better in the future in order to serve on its mandate? So in simple terms, I put you three bullets underneath. In simple terms, the IEU tries to look at evaluations as an accountability function, evaluations as a learning function, and also evaluations as a function for dialogue at the board as well as with the stakeholders. Next slide, please. So Ibrahim had the fortunate opportunity to introduce a little bit on the governing instrument. I will be very quick on this. So from our perspective, we are directly mentioned as a function, as an evaluation function in the governing instrument. And through our terms of reference that had been board approved on the 13th of February in 2014, we got the following mandates. And here I just wanted to give you a glimpse about the objectives of the Independent Evaluation Unit. So first and foremost, we are looking at the question of informing the decision-making of the board. And the decision-making of the board in terms of operations, but as well as strategy. Good morning, thanks for joining us here as well. This means that we will be looking at the question of how to synthesize the lessons learned that we have through our work, as well as how to bring the learning to the GCF Secretariat, but as also to the GCF stakeholders in the GCF ecosystem, as we call it, to think about how can we learn together and improve the operations. Secondly, we look at conducting periodic performance assessments of the GCF. And thirdly, we're also requested to provide these evaluation reports to the COP and the UNFCCC. So that is essentially also why we're here at COP, in order to inform those that are engaged in the negotiations, but also engaged in the larger operationalization of the discussions here at COP. Next slide, please. So in a way, as evaluators, we love to talk about a theory of change, what we are doing, why we are doing it, and how are we doing it. So simply put, I only have 4 things to tell you here. Simply put, we want to provide high quality evidence. And that is key in order to inform the decision making of the board, as I said previously. So this informing of the decision making will hopefully translate into informed investment policies, which will then in turn translate into high impact of investments, and therefore better earth health, as we all are here for the green climate. And that is, simply put, our tagline, the tagline of the IEU. So trusted evidence, informed policies, high impact. Next slide, please. For completeness, I also wanted to present to you something that's very dear to us, and this is how we're doing evaluation and what are we looking at when we look at evaluations. And here I brought to you the IEU evaluation criteria that were laid out in the terms of reference, and since May of this year are also the GCF evaluation criteria, as we have as the board has passed the evaluation policy of the GCF. So these are, for those that are evaluators here in the crowd, these are very common criteria for evaluation. So we're talking about relevance, effectiveness, efficiency, impact, and sustainability of projects and programs. That's if you know the OECD DAC criteria that are sort of the most often used as the blueprint for most of the evaluation criteria, they're very much referring to this. But there are, however, some parts where we felt we needed to go beyond those criteria that are laid out as evaluation criteria for development aid, for development projects, because we're looking here at climate projects. So in addition to the usual DAC criteria, we have at the IEU the criteria of gender equity, coherence, and also the question of unexpected results, both positively and negatively. So this is to tell you as well that in 2014, the members of the board, as well as the GCF as a whole, have been very forward-looking and very basically leaders in this space to say we can't only look at the normal OECD DAC criteria, we need to go actually beyond this. Next slide, please. I wanted to introduce to you as well the evaluation work, the bread and butter that we're looking at here from the IEU's perspective. And we have about 10 evaluations that we have completed. Most often, these are evaluations in 3 areas. One, in the thematic areas. Second, in the areas of strategy. And lastly, also in the area of portfolio, as we look at certain sub-portfolios, and we've just recently finalized an evaluation of the effectiveness and relevance of GCF investments in the small island development states. And we are just, as we speak, finalizing a report on the effectiveness of investments in the least developed countries, to give you an idea of what portfolio means to us. And then in terms of strategy, just to highlight, we have looked in the past at questions of the request for proposal modality that was here at the GCF, which is an alternative access and alternative modality for the GCF, as well as the private sector approach and portfolio. Okay, next slide, please. And I won't bore you much longer with these, but I also wanted to highlight other works and other mandates that we've been given through our terms of reference. And that pertains to this question of advisory support and capacity building support for evaluations and learning. So one thing that we felt is, if evaluations are truly there for the learning component and the learning function of the fund, we ought to look also outside of the fund of what are we learning and what do we know. So here at the IEU, we are providing this learning from the areas of climate change and climate action with global evidence reviews. So these are actually quite pithy products because these are evidence gap maps that will show you in two-dimensional metrics of what we know and what we don't know, so where we're finding gaps about interventions and outcome pairs that have been found relevant and reasonable and have actually shown impact. So with these evidence reviews, we've looked at a couple of evidence reviews in forest conservation, in adaptation, in transformational change that we've just finalized with our counterparts at the climate investment funds this month, and it's a product that's readily available on our website, as well as on private sector instruments in mitigation and results-based payment. Just to give you a glimpse of what sort of topics are there that we are thinking about. And lastly, also on another aspect of capacity building, we realize that the GCF is working together with accredited entities. There can be anything from the MDBs that we all know, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and so on, all the way up to direct access entities. And what we realized is that most often these entities have not a great deal of experience in climate action. So what we have set to do is, how about if we learn in real time on what we are doing here at the GCF? So we've initiated a program which we call the Learning-Oriented Real-Time Impact Assessment window. It's a mouthful. We abbreviated, it's called LORTA here at the IEU and the GCF. And what we do there is we build capacity with about 18 projects so far, where we go into the projects and help the project teams to think about what could be done in addition to the normal monitoring evaluation function to better learn through impact evaluations. And so we're setting up systems that are real-time systems to inform the learning of these projects as they go along. And that's great work, and if you have any questions, I'm really happy to work with you on this. So just the next slide, and I'll leave it at that. Yes, thank you. Another part that is very relevant to us is this question of when we have the evaluations and when we have the learning, how are we ensuring uptake? And this is sort of the last mile problem that we all face at a development institution and climate institution is, if you have the learning that you've found, we learn all the time, but how are we translating this into action? And here we come to this question of uptake and partnerships. And so the IEU sees itself as a knowledge broker between the evaluators, the GCF ecosystem, and the larger GCF, the larger climate finance landscape. So in that way, we are providing several different ways of how to communicate with the outside world and how to basically communicate outside of the headquarters of the GCF, which is based in Songdo, South Korea. And we have found quite a good array of different ways of how to do this. Most importantly, we're encouraging our work that we do with our networks, evaluation networks, but also with the other accredited entities and their evaluation offices to then provide the learning on when it happens. And I've just happened to mention here just a few seconds ago, we also establishing certain partnerships with other climate funds and their learning teams and evaluation teams to create that complementarity and coherence from at least the learning and evaluation perspective. Okay, I would stop here, and I thank you very much for listening in, and I'm really, really looking forward to an engaged discussion later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Thanks for that very comprehensive presentation. You spoke about the theory of change, trusted evidence, informed policies, high impact. And you also spoke about the evaluation criteria, the OECD DAC, and what you have done additionally to include criteria of gender equity, coherence, and also unexpected results. You've completed 10 evaluations in thematic, strategy, and portfolio areas, which is quite impressive. And then you're also providing capacity building support for evaluations and learning through the use of global evidence reviews, and that's very helpful for entities that work with the GCF. Very interestingly, you talked about the learning-oriented real-time impact assessment, LOTA, which is, I think, quite an innovation for the IEU. And I think you rounded up by speaking about how to ensure uptake by GCF entities. So thanks for that presentation. Just to be sure, we'll have a question and answer session, but we thought to go through all three presentations first, if that's okay. But thank you, Andreas. So by the schedule, and forgive me, I'm doubling both as a moderator and a presenter, so I would do my best to shuffle both. But on the schedule, my presentation is next for the Independent Integrity Unit. So let me go straight to that. Can I have the slides up? Thank you. So the Independent Integrity Unit is one of the accountability units of the GCF. Next slide, please. The GCF, this slide shows the GCF business model and the role that the IIU plays in that model. I won't go through all of the text, but the IIU sits as one of the three accountability mechanisms that ensures oversight and provides an integrity framework for the GCF and its related activities. And we do this from accreditation, through the due diligence process, as well as compliance, to ensure that we're working right through the project cycle of the GCF. Next slide, please. Our mission is to ensure that GCF stakeholders adhere to the highest standards of integrity to safeguard the lawful and efficient utilization of GCF resources. And our vision is to be the global leader in climate finance integrity, as well as providing strategic leadership and building strategic alliances. This slide shows an overview. The next slide, please. An overview of the GCF Integrity Framework. So what we've done in the last 5 years that we've been in existence is to build an integrity framework that covers everything from prevention to detection, investigation, and remediation. And the policy on prohibited practices is sort of the ground norm of our integrity policies. And that sets out what practices are prohibited in GCF projects. Everything from corruption to collusion and coercion, but also to sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, etc. Now, under the prevention framework, the Staff Code of Conduct provides guidance for the conduct of staff members of the GCF. The policies on ethics and conflicts of interest address not only staff matters and staff conflict of interest matters, but also covers board members, covers board-appointed officials, it covers accredited observers, and it also covers members of panels and committees, because GCF has a number of panels, independent panels and committees that work with external consultants. We've very importantly developed a policy on anti-money laundering and conflict and financing of terrorism. This AML-CFT policy seeks to provide a framework for addressing the risks of money laundering and terrorist financing. GCF, being a provider of global financing across developing countries, obviously is susceptible to the risks of money laundering. terrorist financing. So this policy was developed to address that, and it provides a comprehensive due diligence approach that's risk-based and addresses all of the FATF recommendations, as well as the UN legal instruments on terrorist financing. So we've also built out the integrity portion of the fiduciary standards of the GCF, which need to be adhered to by all of GCF's partners and project implementers. And as I said, we have a policy on sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, which is now subsumed under the environmental and social safeguards, but it elaborates the prohibitions for conduct of this nature and also provides protection for victims and survivors. On the detection side, we've got a policy on the protection of whistleblowers and witnesses, and we're quite proud of this document because we consider it to be a very progressive policy. In drafting it, we consulted with all the, as many of the existing policies as we could find in public international institutions, but we also looked at Transparency International's framework for whistleblowing. And we not only provided provisions that respect protected reporting, but also went beyond that to create obligations for the institution to protect not only internal whistleblowers, but also external whistleblowers. And we think this is quite progressive and comprehensive. On the investigation side, we've developed the investigation standards, including process rights, and we're also developing an investigation manual. This would ensure that we have very rigid guidelines for conducting investigations that respect due process, but also provide for credible investigation processes with a high standard of proof. On the remediation side, the administrative remedies and exclusions policy, which is in many institutions called a sanctions policy. But in the peculiar nature of the GCF, the word sanctions is somewhat controversial. So we've preferred to use the word exclusions. But that policy then provides the sanctions element for enforcement of determinations of breaches of integrity. And under that policy, we're also developing subsidiary documents which address process and guidelines. Next slide, please. So I'll give a quick overview of the integrity tools that we've developed. And I think I'll speak a little later on the first one, the digital forensics and data analytics. What we have, the approach we have taken is to leverage on technology and to leverage on innovation to be able to effectively monitor the use of GCF resources. GCF potentially operates in the entire developing world. At the moment, we have projects and programs in about 137 countries. And we have committed over $10 billion in financing. To effectively monitor the use of all of these resources requires more than just the traditional approach of reactive responses. So we've elaborated a proactive system using data analytics to create a risk rating of GCF projects, which is based on the use of intelligent automation. We've developed a statistical model which then tracks, using all of the data from projects and programs potentially, which tracks the way that GCF funds are spent, but also which do a risk rating of the compliance of projects with GCF fiduciary standards. Now we've employed this already, and we have very good results from it, which show that it's a validated system. We've done a risk rating of GCF projects and GCF financing instruments, which tend to show that certain financing instruments are more vulnerable to integrity failures. We're looking to use that system to then define the priorities for selecting projects for proactive integrity reviews. What this means is, based on the risk rating, we then identify projects that we go and do a books and records inspection, do procurement inspection, as well as look at generally compliance issues. We intend to have 2 of those done during the course of next year. Proactive reviews are very intense and very extensive, but we're looking to the cooperation of accredited entities to enable us to implement them. And just on this, I would say that we have received tremendous support from the Executive Director of the GCF. The Secretariat has provided access to all of the data that we require, and we're working closely with the monitoring team within the Secretariat. And so we created also an integrity due diligence platform which services the digital forensics work and proactive reviews. As I said, we've developed investigation standards. We're developing the manual. These have been widely consulted. But then we do also work on outreach and capacity building, in addition to providing advisories on policy implementation. Yesterday, we launched a thematic brief on integrity in maladaptation, integrity issues in maladaptation. And that's available on our website. We collaborate with a number of external parties to do this, and we provide advisories based on those thematic briefs to the Secretariat and to the board. I think we can go to the final slide on outreach and capacity building. No, just one slide before, thank you. I think I've managed to confuse my colleagues, my apologies. So here's what we do in capacity building. There are 2 major programs that we've developed. One is a peer-to-peer learning alliance on climate finance integrity. This was actually developed by Transparency International and GIZ, the German cooperation agency, and we were invited to participate, and we're very much involved in this. It's a flagship program for the IIU. What this does is it brings together entities that are either already accredited to the GCF or in the process of seeking accreditation. And we sit together and discuss problems and challenges related to meeting the GCF's integrity standards in the process of accreditation. And it's proved to be very successful. We've had a number of entities then going from preparation to actually approaching the accreditation stages and going through to full accreditation. And we're committed to supporting that going forward. We've also built an integrity forum, which we hold annually. But of course, for the global pandemic, we took a break from that. And that integrity forum consists of 21 organizations, and we had 30 participants at the last COP in Madrid in 2019. That's quite a while ago since we had a COP. But we also signed, what we do is we sign memoranda of understanding with our accredited entities, by which we're able to develop cooperation modalities, including the possibility of joint investigations. And we've currently signed 29 MOUs as of today. So that's an overview of what we do. The key priorities for 2022 for the IIU are to optimize investigation efficiencies and capacities, apply our proactive integrity reviews. We intend to do at least 2 in the coming year. upscale our intelligent automation and risk mitigation work, provide more integrity policy guidelines, guidance and implementation oversight, and provide technical assistance to support capacity building for entities. As Andreas had said, we're dealing with a variety of entities from the World Bank to small entities and island states. And then we're developing a program of awareness raising, communications, and enhancing operational efficiencies. So that's a general overview. I'm sorry, I've probably taken more time than I should have. But that's an overview of the work of the Independent Integrity Unit. And happy to take questions afterwards. Okay. So if I may now, can I turn over to my colleague, Paco, and probably before then ask if our colleague, Dr. Lalanath de Silva, the head of the Independent Redress Mechanism, would like to say a few words. He's joining us virtually. Lalanath?
Thank you, Ibrahim. Welcome, everybody. Glad you are all early risers for this event today. I'm sorry I'm not able to be there with you, but I'm joining you virtually from South Korea, where the Green Climate Fund has its headquarters. But my colleague, Paco Gimenez-Salinas, who is our dispute resolution and compliance specialist, will represent us and make our presentation on our behalf, and I'll be happy to respond to questions afterwards. So with that, let me hand over to Paco.
Okay, thank you very much, Lalana. Thank you very much, Ibrahim Andreas. I'm now going to introduce the independent redress mechanism of the Green Climate Fund. You will see that there are similarities to what my colleagues have presented, and there are also some differences. Similar, the accountability, the way accountability is put in place from the perspective of the independent redress mechanism is that this accountability is triggered by complaints. So we call that citizens-driven accountability in the way that, because complainants will file complaints, and that will trigger either investigation or that will trigger a conversation around potential harm and potential ways of providing redress. So going back to the governing instrument of the GCF that mandated the board to establish the IRM, when it was established, it stated that an independent redress mechanism needed to report to the board and that it needed to receive complaints related to the operations of the fund and that it should make recommendations based on these complaints. So basically, we report directly to the board on those complaints and cases. And this is, sorry, next slide, please. This is a core function, but we also have additional functions that are also similar to those of our colleagues' independent accountability mechanism, independent units as well. So those functions are to also build the capacity of accredited entities. Accredited entities need to have their own grievance redress mechanisms. And so we support them by offering capacity building on how to handle complaints, how to be accessible, independent, and also how to offer redress, etc. We also have a function which is called reconsideration request. When a country has submitted a project or program to the board, and the funding is denied to that country, then they can come to us and ask us to review that decision, and then we can make recommendations to the board to see if they want to reconsider that denial. that has only happened once. I will then talk later about this case. And we finally have an advisory function, which is that we offer advisory services to the board based on two main sources of learning. One is the cases that we handle, and the second source is international best practices. So why is this mandate important? Why how does it benefit the institution? Not only the complainants, but also the institution. Any and every very well-designed project and every well-crafted policies can have gaps, can have unintended problems, can create unintended problems. And if those problems, even small, escalate, they can easily escalate and rapidly escalate to bigger problems. So that could create a problem and a risk to the reputation of the fund. And also that could also create an impact to the finance, to the funds that are provided to projects, because they could eventually be stopped and projects can be interrupted because of those conflicts. So we provide, the benefit is twofold. One is the benefit that we offer to the complainants and to the people that are affected by projects and programs, but also internally, we try to protect the reputation of the institution by dealing with those complaints at the earliest stage possible. Next slide, please. So there are basically two ways in which, coming back to the function of addressing complaints, there are basically two ways in which we can address those. Two types of conflict resolution processes. First, the process that we call compliance review consists of an investigation that is launched at the request of complainants, or if the other alternative, which is a dialogue-based solution process, fails, then that also triggers the investigation. But this investigation aims to determine whether a GCF project has or has not complied with the procedures and policies of the Green Climate Fund, including environmental and social safeguards. If there has been non-compliance, then we also look, that investigation will also look at whether there was harm connected or like derived from this non-compliance. And the investigation will then end up with a report with those findings, and if there is a connection between non-compliance of policies, harm, then the IRM will then recommend remedial actions, remedies that should be put in place to protect the complainants and to bring the project back into compliance. Those remedies can consist of offering compensation to complainants. They can also consist of in mandating that the implementing agency and the GCF conducts wider consultation. But those are just examples of those remedies. The other alternative that stakeholders have in attempting to solve their problems and concerns is to engage in dialogue-based processes. We commonly label them as problem-solving processes, and that includes mediation, information sharing, consultation, neutral fact-finding, etc. In problem-solving, we normally hire a mediator or facilitator that will help the parties to try to find common ground on what are the root causes of the problem and also what could be the potential solutions to it. So it is really like trying to craft a dialogue space, a safe space for dialogue for these problems to be addressed. What is very interesting is that the potential launching of an investigation provides the necessary leverage to the dialogue space. So if parties want to start by trying to solve their issues by negotiation or dialogue, the complainants can always have the option, if they are not satisfied with what is happening during the dialogue process, they can always have the option to put an end to it and to ask the IRM to start the investigation. That gives a lot of leverage to them to at least to be at the table, sitting at the table with a certain equal level of power. Next slide, please. Now I will present the cases that the IRM has handled so far, or that is currently handling. That gives you an overview on where those cases are located, what are the status of these cases. So some cases are being declared eligible, some others ineligible, some of them have been closed, and some others are open. Next slide, please. So the first case that we handled was a case regarding a GCF project in Bangladesh. The complaint had been filed by Transparency International Bangladesh, and it was brought on behalf of around 400 residents and the mayor of the municipality in a city called Satkhira. The complaint stated that at the moment of disbursement of the fund for the project, because of the disbursement of the fund had been delayed, residents of the project site had been experiencing adverse impacts from climate change. So basically, what the complainants were saying, there is a project that has been approved, but now GCF, because you are delaying the implementation of it, we are facing negative consequences. The case was the first ever case of the IRM, and it was determined that it was ineligible because the impacts were not caused by the project itself, but they were caused by the climate change. Next slide, please. The second case was in relation to a project in Peru. And that was a very unique case because it was self-initiated. So the IRM, under certain circumstances, can trigger a complaint or can trigger the processes to look at whether there's harm is being produced with relation to a project. Those require. There are several requirements that need to be met, and those are that there has to be credible information that around the harm that is potentially being caused. That also these adverse impacts are posing significant reputational risk to the GCF, and that third, that the affected people were unable to submit the complaint themselves. So in this case, those requirements, the IRM decided that those requirements were met, and therefore we started to look into that. And the problem was basically that there were concerns about miscategorization of the project. That was a C-level project. That was a low-risk project. We were looking into whether that was adequate, the level of risk was adequate or not. And also, we were looking at whether FPIC, like free, prior, and informed consent, had been conducted satisfactorily for the complainants. We were also looking at land rights, impacts to land rights, and also, basically those are where the impacts that we are looking at. So the outcome was that the GCF agreed to put in place several actions. So there was a FPIC guidance that was issued to further clarify how FPIC needed to be conducted in the future. There was risk category guidance also that was issued. And there was a legal opinion was commissioned to look into the land titling concerns. And also it was mandated that it needed to be ensured that the consent documentation was completed. Next slide, please. The next case was a case related to a water conservation project in Morocco. The nature of the complaint was that there was insufficient consultation and a lack of information that was provided to community members. And in that case, parties agreed to proceed to problem solving. So we hired a mediator on the ground, and that mediator facilitated a conversation around the lack of information. Information was provided, and the complainant was satisfied with it, and therefore we closed the case. Next slide, please. The fourth case was related to a GCF project in India. In this case, and in other cases, the complainant requested his information to be kept confidential. And the main alleged complaint was that the state government of Andhra Pradesh in India had announced a housing development plan that was causing the destruction of mangroves in a protected zone, and that the GCF should have stopped it. The IRM declared the case ineligible because the felling of the mangroves for the housing scheme did not occur within the GCF project area. Nevertheless, the case was then referred to the grievance redress mechanism of UNDP, and then UNDP decided that was referred with the consent of the complainant. Then UNDP looked at the eligibility criteria in a different way. They have their own eligibility criteria, and they declared the case eligible, and they are now looking into it. Next slide, please. In August 2020, the IRM received this complaint related to a project in South Africa. But we had suspended the complaint because after talking with the complainant, it was clear that the complainant only wanted to have more information about the project activities and goals, etc. So we redirected him to the avenues that people have to get access to information, but we can anytime reopen the case if the complainant or if that person decides that he's not satisfied with the information that is being provided to him. The next case is the one that the IRM is currently handling. This is a case related to a project in Nicaragua. The project is called Bioclima. It is FP 146. And in this case, the complainants, who also had requested confidentiality, alleged that the project would harm indigenous and Afro-descendant communities. And their allegations were that they had several allegations. One was that prior to the approval of the project, there has been no consultation with communities, including no FPIC. Second, that the project would lead or will lead to environmental degradation and attacks by armed non-indigenous settlers. And three, that the accredited entities' actions do not seem to comply with GCF policies, especially when it comes to participation and information disclosure. Fourth, that the GCF board conditions, so the GCF had approved to instruct that several conditions needed to be applied, especially when, one that instructed to have an independent monitor or independent monitoring of the project. So the concern was that the GCF board conditions placed on the project related to this monitoring would not be then further developed by the accredited entity and the executing entities. So this case has been declared eligible, and we are now at what we call the initial steps stage of the complaints managing, which is the stage where parties need to decide whether they want to launch an investigation or whether they want to try to solve the case by using mediation or dialogue or negotiation. The last case that was triggered by a complaint was a case that we received from Pakistan. In that case, the complainant raised the concern that fees due to the complainant's work had not been paid, despite that he had completed the work under a consultancy contract with the accredited entity, in this case UNDP again. And so after getting more information about the nature of his contract, then he decided to withdraw the complaint. Lastly, talking about reconsideration requests, the IRM has handled one reconsideration request that was filed in 2018 by Argentina in relation to FP057, where the FP057 was denied funding by the board. And then Argentina submitted a request for reconsideration. But and then after several consultations, Argentina decided also to withdraw let's say the request and to try to adjust the project and to resubmit it to the board for approval. So that's all for the mandate, functions, and cases of the IRM, and happy to take questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Paco. Thanks, that's very interesting. Thank you for the case studies, 7 case studies, including the reconsideration request from Argentina. You gave an overview of the jurisdiction and mandate of the IRM, including your functions to additional functions for capacity building to enable accredited entities to develop their own redress functions. And you also spoke of the unique feature of the IRM, which is reconsideration requests. I think that's a very, very important element of your work. And also about the benefits of having a redress mechanism, because it addresses problems with beneficiaries, but also protects the GCF itself from those issues. And how you manage complaints by a compliance review or a dialogue-based problem-solving approach. So many thanks. We are running far behind time, but I think we've got the next 15 or 20 minutes for questions. So with your indulgence, I'd like to open up for any questions, both from the live audience as well as from the virtual audience. Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Jerry Fox from British Council in Dhaka. Firstly, thank you. It was a really interesting presentation. Very much enjoyed it. I have a couple of questions, if I can. We work very closely with partners that are working with NIEs there to present proposals to the GCF. And to date, I think there's 2 sort of observations. One is most of them are mitigation. There's very little adaptation, and the other is that where the projects have been approved, they tend still to be in silos. And so this sort of comes to the coherence question, I think, Andreas, that you were referring to at the beginning. Is there any consideration? I know we're thinking, or we've been exploring with GCF, the idea of having a whole country approach where we look at an overall strategy where we can bring together different elements so that we have an overall adaptation strategy. So your thoughts on how we could improve the implementation of a broader strategic approach? That's my first question. The second question is around the complaints mechanism, and I'm interested very much in the Bangladesh example. And here you were saying you appear to recognize recognise that there was, in fact, a claim in terms of the fact that people have been disadvantaged because of climate change, but it wasn't relevant to GCF. And I wonder, is there anything in terms of accountability, in terms of GCF managing projects in a timely manner? Because obviously if the longer things are delayed, the less able they are to respond to adaptation needs. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that. If it's okay with you, colleagues, see if there are a couple more questions, and then we can have responses. Any other question from the live audience or comments?
Hi, my name is Diana. I'm with Northwestern University in the States. And I was just wondering, I know it's probably very different for all three of you, but at this COP in particular, there's been a lot of conversation, not nearly as much about like maybe the most getting resources effectively to the most vulnerable, but more ensuring that those resources are building resiliency. And so I didn't know if the three of you could maybe talk about how thinking about either building resiliency or getting those resources to most vulnerable communities impacts the work that you're doing, or where it fits into the kind of the chain, because all three of you kind of talked about the different chains of your specific units. And so I'm wondering how kind of this larger discourse like fits into the work that each of your different organizations or units of the GCF are doing.
Thanks very much. We'll note that. Any other questions from the live audience? I'll also turn to my colleagues if there are any questions from the virtual audience. Could you send those through, please? So let's probably address the two questions that have been asked. I'll hand over to my colleague Andreas, noting also that Dr. Lalanath de Silva is online, if he would also like to respond, particularly to the last two frame questions. Andreas, please.
Yeah, thank you, Ibrahim, and thanks again to the British Council to have such eloquent and interesting questions for us, as well as the question from the second audience member. If you don't mind, Ibrahim, I just wanted to reach out to all others here in the pavilion as well. Look, I'm an evaluator, so we often ask ourselves, who are we speaking to, and what are we actually doing in terms of difference. If you don't mind, just for my recollections as well, a little bit on how I frame my response. Could I ask you just for a show of hands who you are? If you are from an NGO, could you just a short show of hands, so we'll see here from the 20 members, no one from the NGOs. Any government and national representatives of anyone here in the audience? Wow, one we've got. That's good. One of, let's say, two we've got. Okay, here we go. Anyone from the private sector? Private sector? Yeah, we've got one from the private sector. Thank you, gentleman there in the back. And anyone from academia and think tanks? I think we've got a couple of here, 3, 4. I see 3, 4. Okay, very interesting indeed. A good diverse crowd, but mostly focused on thinking ahead. Look, Ibrahim, thanks again for giving it to me. On the question of adaptation, one thing that we find, and I think it's really crucial, if you think of what we've heard so far here at the COP, and what we've heard also initially when the COP was opened, and I'm referring here to the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, who said very clearly, we are facing 3 different gaps at the moment. The one gap is that we are trying very desperately to look at the mitigation efforts that we can do as an international crowd. We're looking at mitigation efforts here from the NDC's perspective, and most often we realize that even with the NDCs, we're banking on technologies that have yet to be developed and arrive here in order to address all the mitigation efforts that mitigation needs that we have here in the developing world, but also in the developed world, so as a global community. The second gap that we have is on adaptation. And here, we're very, very far from 50-50 And I think you're spot on with your question in that regard. We as an international community, we have not managed to give the 50-50 balance between mitigation and adaptation. And lastly, also thinking about finance. And we are the GCF, so we're talking a lot about finance. And still, we're far behind. We're far behind when it comes to our financial efforts that we wanted to do in terms of reaching not only finance for mitigation, but also for adaptation. In addition to this, also financing those needs that we have in the most vulnerable communities in the developing world. And we are currently undertaking evaluation in the least developed countries, and I mentioned the SIDS before. What has been seen at international level, again at global level, is that we're not financing the SIDS. And indeed, the entire investments that goes towards this has decreased over the recent years. So that is quite concerning for us, to be honest, as evaluators, but also as those that are sitting in organizations and trying to shape organizations in the right way. Now, let me come to this question that you've asked on what do we know from the GCF and where we're going forward. So we see that the GCF is putting a lot of efforts into the question of adaptation and looking at larger programs that would take care of some of those adaptation efforts, because adaptation efforts are not only national efforts, they're most likely regional efforts as well as global efforts. So what we see, however, in the portfolio as it is so far, we're seeing out of the 67 projects that we have in adaptation, and I'm talking here about our evaluation results and our evaluation findings on the adaptation evaluation, which is a little bit, I hope you don't mind me saying, a little bit outdated, because the evaluation was only presented in the beginning of this year, so February. So we have progressed a little bit since then, but it's around about the 67 projects that we have. Only 4 are programs. Only 4 are programs. So we're far behind when we think about larger aspects of adaptation finance. And then the next question that we ask ourselves, okay, if we look at the array of accredited entities that we have, and we've been speaking about this, from the NDBs all the way down to the direct access entities, so to the true stakeholders in the country that could bring forward some of these aspects, we realize as well that more than half of all the adaptation portfolio, more than 50%, sit with 6 UN and EU organizations. And those are international accredited entities. So if one was to ask, and how far have we come with respect to financing in a true integrated manner, with the countries, with the stakeholders in the countries, one would have to acknowledge that we're still lagging behind. We have, as a GCF, the direct access mandate, but we haven't been able to operationalize this fully. And now, since I've been talking about direct access and access just now, we've also done an accreditation synthesis where we looked at the question of accreditation. And accreditation is sort of the gateway to the GCF finance, the access point that you all have to pass. And that's very much related to the work that Ibrahim and his team, Ibrahim and his team are working on when they're thinking about environmental social safeguard standards, but most importantly also the fiduciary standards that entities would have to bring forward. So on direct access, we had looked at the direct access in the accreditation synthesis. And what we found is, even if we were to continue our mandate and would double the efforts that we currently have with respect to our direct access entities and the accreditation of direct access entities, we would still not reach more than 25% of what we're trying to reach. So we still not there to get to really entice and really enable direct access entities to come forward with projects. So lastly, let me just make one other point. Let me make 2 other points, just if you allow me. So on the access point, so coming back on what I said with the accredited with the programs, the few programs that we have, we've also looked at the question of the adaptation projects approval span, the period it takes to get projects approved. And what we found there is, just to give you an idea here, it takes extremely long to get adaptation projects through at the GCF until implementation. So I've got some numbers that I wrote down here. So from submission to the approval of proposals, it takes up to, on average, it takes up to 350 days. And that's the average that we see. So it takes almost 1 year to do that. Compared to mitigation, we're about 60, 70 days more. That means mitigation takes also long. It's perhaps not the great comparator to use the own organization to compare, but just to give you an idea. But that is not all. Once the project is approved, you're basically going through all the legal arrangements that you have to do. And so we looked at what happens after approval, board approval, and how long it takes to get actually to the first implementation point in time. And here we found it takes another 449 days on average to go through the legal arrangements that you have to do in order to get adaptation projects. And that is, as we find, is a trend that's also increasing when we looked at the project pipeline that we have. So the projects that are currently bringing forward concept notes to the GCF, this trend is only increasing, and that's concerning. So we ought to think about how can we bring larger programs to the ground that truly think about adaptation in order to reach the goal of 50-50 balance, as well as sufficient finance for adaptation. And one thing that it really strikes us then is when we think about, and there's many reasons for this. One driver that it most often is named is the capacity in the countries. So we've also looked briefly at the capacity, and from the evaluation perspective, there's two things. We've done an evaluation on the readiness support program in 2018. We've looked at the capacity again with the adaptation evaluation in particular to better understand what are the capacity concerns here. And what we found is two things. One is there is an incredible amount of transaction costs that is related to the projects. Because, as I said, they're mostly international accredited entities that are doing projects, and those international accredited entities have high costs to shoulder in order to go to some remote areas and rural areas in the global south, in the least developed countries, as well as very remote islands in the small island states. And that requires greater coordination across the array of other funders and other organizations, bilateral, multilateral funders for climate projects that are out there. So in essence, what we are arguing for is these coordination costs, these high transaction costs, ought to be addressed by creating greater coherence and complementarity in the climate phase. And I think that responds to some of both of your concerns here. I'll stop here. Sorry for taking so long. Yeah.
Not at all, and I dare not have interrupted you. I think that answer probably covers for all of the units, but thank you for comprehensive answer. Just to check, and I'm really struggling because I would like to close on time, but I'm more than happy to take another couple questions if there are from the audience, and I'll come back to you, Paco, in a minute. Any other questions that are really burning we could take? There are none on the virtual platform. No other questions going once. Paco, please.
So I know that Lalana wants to respond the question around the Bangladesh case, and then I will then respond on the question around resilience.
Thank you, Paco. I'm going to
we'll give you a couple minutes if that's okay.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I wanted to respond to Jerry's question about the case from Bangladesh. This was a very early case, 5 years ago. There was half the number of staff in the GCF that we have now. And there were, as you heard from Andreas, considerable time lags between the approval by the board of a project and the actual delivery of the funds to the project itself. And this is largely due to the fact that there were legal agreements, etc., that had to be signed and preconditions that had to be fulfilled before funds could be dispersed. So the complaint in the Bangladesh case was essentially that funds had been approved by the board 2 years before, actually, and in 2015, but had not reached them even as at 2017. And as valid as that complaint was, the impacts that the people said they were suffering. Some 470 residents of the Satkira municipality, the mayor as well, signed and over their representation to Bangladesh, Transparency International Bangladesh, and they were the ones who filed the complaint. The impacts were caused by climate change rather than the project itself, and so our mandate did not extend that far. However, that said, though we declared the case ineligible, as soon as we informed the Secretariat of the fact that a complaint had been filed, within the week, the agreement, which had been delayed, was actually signed. So something came out of the case, things were speeded up. But despite that, I'm afraid, I think funding, we delayed another 2 years or so before it could actually be released. Because these agreements often have conditions that accredited entities have to fulfill before funds can be dispersed. And there can be delays on the side of the accredited entity as well with regard to fulfilling those conditions. So that's what actually happened. But something came out of it in that the agreements were signed pretty fast. I'll leave the rest, the other question to Paco.
Thank you, Lalana. So answering the question about how the IRM can build the resilience of communities, first of all, I want to highlight the fact that projects are never neutral. They have always an impact, whether positive or negative. And in cases where there's existing conflictual situations, where there are conflicting, conflict-prone context, those projects can also sometimes exacerbate conflict. So the first thing we want by addressing complaints is to look at them at the earliest stage possible so that we prevent conflict from escalating into bigger problems. The second thing is that when those complaints that are being filed to the mechanism, they are also connected to, let's say, these historical conflicts on the ground, or like regional conflicts. We tend to provide a space, a neutral space, a safe space, where communities who have filed the complaint can have a level playing field where they can address the complaint with at least better position than if they were trying to solve it themselves without the support of the IRM. So that is, I think that really contributes not only to solve the complaint itself, but also at least to improve a little bit the situation on the ground when this is the case. Also, what we do is when engaging in mediation, we also build the capacity of parties on how to solve conflicts. So we can start mediation by offering training so that people have a similar understanding of what mediation means to them. And so we are also building the capacity and also the understanding of the counterparts, because sometimes those complaints bring into light situations that the counterparts were not aware of. So that creates, let's say, hopefully an improved situation for all parties involved.
Thank you very much, Paco. And thank you, Lalanath, for the response. I think we have addressed all the questions and all the answers. So it remains for me to thank you, especially the audience who are sitting in the pavilion with us. Thanks for making the time to attend. We hope that this has been useful in some ways. The GCF is a unique institution in many respects, but I think in this respect, it's probably even more so. As the largest dedicated climate fund globally, it has a unique structure where we have an accountability mechanism composed of both evaluation, redress, and integrity that provides accountable oversight to the board and to all GCF stakeholders. I'd encourage you to go on our website and have a look at the information that's available. We're happy to take questions offline, and we look forward to future engagements with you. So on behalf of my colleagues, Dr. Lalanath, who's joining us online, on behalf of Andreas, who's been with us, and Paco, thanks very much for being here, and wish you a pleasant last day of the COP. Thank you.